All right, friends. So good to see you all, and thank you all for being here so timely with respect to the person who just apologized. Like, we hadn't even finished going over tech support, so I think a full-ish class by 3 minutes after our start time is pretty impressive. And we'll take a moment to arrive. I think we have the same number of people here that we had last week, so that probably says we should get started. I'm going to go into class tonight with the assumption that everybody received the email in advance. Great, I am seeing nods. If you chose not to take a look at those resources, that's fine. You're welcome to pull them up. I have a loose plan for how this class is going to go tonight, and it is in some part dependent on not spending a whole lot of time discussing the optional reading, because that was meant as sort of a side delve for people who really wanted to think about in-depth categories of transgression. That said, I part of my intention for tonight is to make time for questions and reflections. So, hence loose plan. But let's start with a little moment of centering ourselves. So first, just check your posture. Check if you were arriving here in a hurry or a little bit frazzled from your day, and give yourself a little bit of forgiveness, release. Notice internally how you are arriving. And if there is a reality to how you are arriving that you feel like is relevant to your capacity to participate tonight, and you would like us to know, feel free to write a word or a sentence about that in the chat. Like, for example, you could write, I'm feeling really exhausted, or I'm feeling overwhelmed, or I'm jittery about some other situation, etc. You get the idea. If anyone would like to share anything you're bringing to the space tonight, you are welcome to do so in the chat. Just a word or phrase. And now that we've had a moment for that internal reflection, I closed last week's class with an invitation to try to do some Teshuva that you journaled about. And I'm curious if anyone would like to share about either that process of doing it or the resistance that came up if you thought about doing it and wound up not. That is a little bit vulnerable. So I'm actually going to pause the recording. Give me a moment. So two big things that have come up with this sharing are about how the teshuva we do generally, if we're talking about ben adam lechavero commandments between a human being and another human being, they involve a dynamic that is beyond our control, because we cannot control the way another human being is going to react in relationship to us. That's where we often go astray in the first place, in trying to control or in thinking that the other person should react in a certain way. And it is something that can make teshuva very complicated, because we're afraid that our apology will be used as a weapon against us. We are afraid that it will make things worse. But the other insight that has just come up is that the framework of thinking about teshuva can help work against a tendency that happens with many of the people we're in relationship with, which is that most of our relationships are not neutral. Like, they're the relationships that we think about and invest energy in. We either have people we care about and who care about us and are invested in our well-being, and there's people that are, more conflictual. They may also be invested in our well-being. We may also care about them. But when it comes to thinking about Teshuva, if we're just turning to the people around us, there will be a tendency, if someone is angry at us, to be very accusatory towards us and to be blowing the situation probably more out of proportion than we deserve. And if people love us and care about us and don't like to see us miserable, they will have the tendency to say, oh no, you did the right thing. Don't worry about it. Don't blame yourself. You couldn't have done anything different. And somewhere between those two tendencies is probably where the reality of our situation lies. And so, as one of our participants has pointed out, just the framework of Teshuva, that there is a concept of right and wrong. There is a concept of knowing internally what the right behavior is and what the wrong behavior is, and checking our behavior against that internal knowing, not against someone else's anger or someone else's attempts to reassure us, that is very valuable. So I really appreciate the sharing that has brought these truths to the surface. So very rich. Now I want to ask, what questions or challenges have come up from the reading for this week?
I have to say, when I read it, so like at the end of last class, you kind of posed a question about think about this for next week. And one of the things that I thought about was addressed, I feel like, exactly in the reading in regards to when it's a systemic problem and it's a system that's in place that's the problem. How can I, as an individual, impact that and make teshuva for my role within the system without, I don't know, without taking on the whole system or without being able to change the system, or like the problem of in, like increments. I can't think of the right word, but like of little tiny changes building up to a huge change. Anyway, that was something that I took away from the reading that addressed what I had been thinking last week also, or my problems with.
Thank you for that. Yeah, and we are all dealing with in this class and in this reality, harms that we participate in perpetrating through no intention, but simply because we live in a society that is set up to perpetrate harm.
The example that really struck me from the reading was the college example. Like, I'm not purposely hurting someone else by wanting that spot in the college, but I also understand that the system is set up for it to be more likely for me to get have the opportunity to get the spot and then also take advantage of the spot. And so that really resonated when I was trying to process through a bunch of this stuff.
Thank you. Any other sharings?
I have a couple thoughts. I don't know if they'll make a whole lot of sense, but one of the things, like, because I'm part of a 12-step program too, of we practice a lot of awareness, acceptance, action. And so I like to think of this as like, I have to really be aware of like the systemic racism that happens and what that looks like for me. And then acceptance is kind of where I have to like, I think the first part is like awareness. I get into the guilt, and then the acceptance is just realizing that the guilt, doesn't help me, but being willing to show up to like these spaces and other spaces to keep talking about it, and I think by just being comfortable talking about racism and what our part is, just, like I can, like the article said, I can drive down the street and not get pulled over. I can go for a walk in my neighborhood and not worry about somebody shooting me. And so those things, and just by keeping those conversations alive, I think that we will start to make incremental changes. And by having conversations with our colleagues and friends that are people of color, and really listening to their, um, what they go through, I think then we can start to have some kind of what I think of as like living amends, or teshuva through action, and we can make policy changes at some point and change the system at some point, but it's going to take a lot of us to change.
Thank you, Maria. I'm just going to pause for a moment because there is a lot of background noise in my context that I have the power to change. So give me a moment. Thank you all for your patience. Right. When the system is bigger than us, it becomes very easy to shut down or to tell ourselves that there is no teshuva that we can do as individuals. And to some extent, that is true. And I would suggest that is why, for those of you who took a look at the additional optional reading assignments, we have all of our confessions on Yom Kippur in the plural. And this built-in system of a gathering together in large collectives to confess collective transgression. We have done these things, we have done these things, we have done these things. For the sin we have committed, for the sin we have committed, for the sin we have committed. And the naming of transgression as a transformative act. Any other reflections or questions that come up? Ferris, please, and then Virginia. Ferris. Okay.
Yeah, I am a person who has, in this, because we're talking about the bigger system. I have a situation in the bigger system that I have a lot more privilege than many people. And for instance, I had the opportunity to get a vaccination recently. Because I've been connected to, even tangentially, to the medical system, the medical world. But in a real but tangential way, I've been connected. And so I did go ahead and get the vaccination. And I could have stepped back and said, well, I'm not a frontline person. But I wanted it. So I went ahead and took the opportunity that was offered to me. And I find that I do that in my life in a lot of different ways. And so I'm trying to think inside myself how to respond to that. Is it okay to do something good over here, but do something selfish over here? Anyway, I'm thinking a lot about how to think about that, and how how to behave in my life.
I appreciate your vulnerability in sharing that. And, you know, it reminds me of a conversation. Some of you come to Torah study with me most Thursdays, and a conversation that we were having that kept coming up throughout the second half of Genesis as we were studying all of the Torah portions having to do with the life of Jacob. Jacob has this transformative experience. He wrestles with an angel. His name is changed from Jacob to Yisrael, one who wrestles. And, you know, if you just stop the story there, you would think Jacob is this like transformed person who goes from being the one grasping after what his brother has and always scrambling for his place to, like, you know, maybe at peace with his whatever. And it's not the case. Jacob, throughout the rest of his life, wrestles, continues to make choices that as readers we think are not great choices, continues to be a reactive, fearful person who feels a little bit betrayed by his lot in life. And the blessing of wrestling is a blessing of wrestling. And when we have transformation, what happens after that transformation is not that life becomes easy, but that we are open to the ongoing wrestling. So, you know, I think your question is very poignant, Ferris, in that it's not, you know, can I do something good over here, but do something selfish over here? I think the answer is obviously, like, that's what we all do. You know, when we know better, right? Before we know better, we just always do the selfish thing. And then when we know better, it's this constant meditation of, am I going to think to do the good thing? Am I going to succumb to temptation? And sometimes it's not going to be clear. And we have different cultural contexts militating in different directions, how we should even think about this. I read the New York Times Magazine every Sunday. I don't know how many of you read The Ethicist in the New York Times Magazine. I find it very fascinating because sometimes our current cultural context framework of what the ethicist says, he will say, you know, you have the right to do this thing. You might not feel good about it. You know, you might know that, like, really ideally you should do better, but ethically you have the right. And so there's like what we ethically have the right to do from our dominant cultural framework, which is not always the same thing as what our Jewish tradition would tell us we have the right to do, and is not always the same thing as what our internal conscience would tell us we have the right to do. So we are in the wrestling. That is what it is to be awake. And I think the only thing that is the worst mistake we can make is that assuming because I made a selfish choice and I already knew better, that means I've fallen off the wagon of trying to be a good person and I should just give up. We are always going to make selfish choices and realize afterwards, maybe that was a more selfish choice than I want to make. Or maybe we will justify it to ourselves, but say, you know, in a similar but slightly more stringent situation, I would make a different choice. And the wrestling will not go away. Okay, I'm aware that Virginia has wanted to say something, and I believe Jacob wanted to say something.
Oh, hey, thanks. I really appreciate all that was just shared. Yeah, I mean, that's very fascinating. The thing that I loved learning, it wasn't a conflict with, but was the three different, can you guys hear me okay? The three kinds of harm. And that two of them are unintentional. And I just was struck reading that and making some notes that, you know, I had the similar thought to someone else spoke to awareness, because harm is harm, whether we're aware of it or not. And in a lot of racial justice contexts, I hear people kind of reflexively respond, well, what am I supposed to do about it? I don't own slaves, or, I didn't take the land from the Indians. And so to me, it really touches into the not free to desist. It's like, we don't have to do it all, but once we're aware, as you said, then we have to. So learning about the three different types was fascinating to me. Thank you.
Thanks, Virginia. Jacob? And you're still muted.
Devin was waiting long before me, and my 5th grade ethics tell me I have to.
Okay, go ahead, Devin. Well, Devin, and then Jacob, and then we're going to move on.
Virginia touched on this. I think one thing that I'm surprised hasn't been explicitly stated is thinking about Pirkei Avot, Rabbi Tarfon saying, it's not upon you to complete the work, but you can't desist from it either. I think about some Buddhist dharma that I won't go into, about the debt that you owe to every being on the planet, and how it's impossible to meet them all. And that actually gives you a surprising amount of freedom to do what you can. Like the example I have in my own life is, so I work as a physician, and I've gotten hooked into what's called Occupy Medical, which is an incredibly dedicated group of people focusing particularly on the unhoused over the last 9-10 years. And I volunteer with them, providing services probably every week in some way. And I'm not fixing housing. They're more involved with this than I am. The answer is not more medical care. The answer is housing. The answer is substantive change. But if you can ease suffering even a little bit, that can be part of the work, because not everything is going to change right away. And if you wait to chip in until that change happens, then you'll never be part of it.
Amen. And not letting the perfect be the enemy of the good. And thank you for bringing up the quote from Rabbi Tarfon. Our TBI members are probably aware, but not everybody participating is aware, that this summer Temple Beth Israel signed on to the hashtag Not Free to Desist campaign based on that quote by Rabbi Tarfon. It's not yours to finish the task, but neither are you free to desist from doing your part, which was a call by Jews of color nationally to address racism within Jewish institutions. And this series of conversations is very much a part of our thinking about this. Jacob, and then we're gonna a little more systematically dive deeper into the work that Rabbi Avi Killip outlined for us in her forward article that I guess many of you read.
I don't need to speak very long, because I think most everybody said what I really wanted to say, except for Ferris was talking at the beginning about her dilemma. And I too am part of a 12-step program in which, when I started, all my decisions were bad. All my choices were unethical. And over the years, that and therapy have evolved. So I feel like my choices are more ethical. But what I've found is that what you're called to do gets deeper, rather than, oh, I've accomplished everything and I am an ethical human. The subtleties begin, and what you owe another person, what you owe yourself, what you owe the world becomes more complicated, not less. And you're required to give more. And for my 12-step program, that's what the 10th step is about, is that every night you reflect. And just sitting here, I have figured out several ways in which I am not, that there are simple everyday things that I could be doing that would increase my knowledge and understanding and engagement with very little effort. And that's what I think. It's just a constant growth.
Great. So I think we're getting there. We're getting into the nature of the work. And so to take us deeper, I'm going to just recap, because I assumed that some people, bless your hearts, did not have the chance to read Rabbi Avi Killip's forward article. So I'm going to just very briefly recap it, and then invite you into some journaling and small group sharing. So Rabbi Avi Killip has an article in the forward, and it's linked in the sheet that in the email that I sent to you before this class. And she talks about a sort of obscure Talmudic discussion based on some verses in Torah describing the penalties and the consequences for the owner of an ass of an ox that gores, that causes damage. So in the original Torah category, it's really talking about an ox that hurts someone, that attacks and injures a person. But the Talmudic category the Talmudic discussion winds up expanding the categories, as Talmudic discussions so often do, and into 3 large subcategories of the goring ox. And thank you to Caitlin, who just put Avi Killip's article in the chat. I actually found this article. Rabbi Killip works for the Hadar Institute in New York City, which is the producer, as those of you who have learned from me probably have heard before, of a lot of really powerful and beautiful Torah. And in the Hadar Institute, there is, if you search deep in there, record and source sheets from a teaching, including, I think, the audio recording of like an hour and a half of her teaching to like some group in Westchester about Teshuva and racial injustice. And she references this article that she wrote. But if you're interested, I can try to find the link later to the full Teshuva teaching. So anyway, she defines 3 categories of goring ox that the Talmud talks about. And one is keren, literally meaning horn. And this is the category that Torah seems to be most explicitly describing. An ox that is seeking to attack someone, using it, butting its head against someone deliberately. And that is an ox that causes harm that they have intended to cause. The next category is regel, literally meaning leg, or walking. The ox that causes damage basically as a byproduct of the way that it exists in the world, as the way that it walks through the world. It didn't mean to trample your garden. It just happened to be getting from point A to point B, and it's an ox. And your garden was in the way between point A and point B. And so your garden got trampled. If the ox had feelings, it would probably feel bad unless the ox were defensive, in which case the ox would get defensive. And then the third category is shein, literally meaning tooth. And that is when the ox is intending to do the thing that it does, but not for the sake of causing harm, rather for its own pleasure. The ox didn't want to deprive you of your vegetables when it ate the vegetables in your garden that were between point A and point B. The ox was just hungry and wanted to eat. No hard feelings intended. She writes, the ox didn't mean to knock over your fence. It just needed to scratch its back, and the fence was there. And the ox didn't know how poorly built the fence was and that it would fall down when it scratched its back against your fence. So that's shein. That's the ox just seeking its own well-being, its own pleasure, not intending any harm. And as someone said, and I'm sorry I forget who, the particularly powerful thing about this is that 2 out of 3 categories of this harm come without any intention to harm. And so much of the harm that we do that we might realize later we need to do teshuva for, we probably do without any intention to cause harm. And yet it is still a category of harm. And in some ways it can be more difficult to recognize the need for teshuva. We can very quickly regret hurting someone when we lose our temper. or when we know we have sought to attack them and we later feel bad about them. But it can be much harder to do the teshuva for that which the harm that we not only didn't intend to cause, but we maybe weren't even aware that we had caused it. So I invite us to take a few minutes and journal about this. We'll journal, you know what, I'm going to do it this way. I'm going to, I want us to take a few minutes for each category, and then we're going to break into breakout rooms and discuss the upshot of our journaling in each category. So the first category you are going to journal about is Karen, horn, hurt that we have intentionally caused. Can you think of an example of hurt that you know you have intentionally caused? How did it feel to do that? How did it feel in the aftermath? How did you do teshuva, or what was the barrier to doing teshuva? I'm going to write those questions in the chat, and I'm going to set, it's just the beginning. You're not going to get all your thoughts out, but I'm going to set a 3-minute timer. All right, let's finish that. Whatever thought you're working on, and you can come back to your journaling later if it will be useful to you. You can leave a bookmark there, and we're going to move on to the next category. Regel, leg. When the way we naturally walk through the world causes harm. And your journaling prompts are, what happens when you realize or it is pointed out to you that you have caused harm in this way? And then again, how do you do teshuva / what are the barriers? Again, what happens when you realize or it is pointed out to you that you have caused harm in this way? And I encourage you to, be specific. And how do you do teshuva, or what are the barriers? And we'll take 4 minutes this time. No, we'll take 3 minutes again. All right, friends, we'll finish up that thought for now. And we'll go into our third learning. We'll go into our third category. Shane, when you commit harm without intent, but in the course of pursuing your own well-being. And I'm going to name, I'm going to suggest, I'm going to give you an extra minute for this one, because I'm going to suggest that this is maybe the hardest category. Because if, regel can be hard, it can be hard to learn to respond non-defensively when it is pointed out the unintentional harm that we cause, but it can be learned. And there's exists a lot of good resources for learning to respond non-defensively and mildly when it is pointed out, oops, you accidentally caused harm. But this category is where it gets really hard. This is where we come to questions about college and vaccines and things that we really want and maybe are not going to stop wanting, and maybe we're not going to stop trying to get. And the fact that because we live in a society where so much is set up to be zero sum, that means that we often pursue what is good for us without any intent to harm anyone else, but in ways that do harm others. So we're going to take a little extra time for journaling about this one. Shame is when you commit harm without intent, but in the course of pursuing your own well-being. What happens when you realize, or it is pointed out to you, that you caused harm in this way? How do you do Teshuva? / what is the barrier to Teshuva? We will take 4 minutes. So we'll take a pause from that. And I'm going to invite you into small groups now to reflect with each other just what you are learning from this study in journaling and what it is bringing up for you. And to the extent that you are accepting assignment from me, your job in your small groups is to, as best you can, refrain from doing 2 things. Refrain from shaming each other, which I think you will all be fairly good about already. Don't give each other a hard time about something that one of you is wrestling with, but also refrain from the thing we talked about earlier. Try as best you can to refrain from the entirely natural human impulse to reassure each other, to tell each other, oh no, well, that's not so bad. You were really doing your best. Don't worry about that. Just help. Your job as best you can is to help each other and help yourselves hold the discomfort of what's coming up and know that you are not alone in that discomfort. Can I get a reaction of whether this is an assignment that you can live with? Okay. Your job is not to fix everything this moment. Your job is to inhabit, and you don't try not to go to the also. Okay. Third thing that you want to refrain from doing, try not to go to the brainstorming of what we're going to do about this. You don't have enough time to fix this. So I'm going to give you 15 minutes. That's going to be 3 screens per group. So about 5 minutes per screen. Sorry, that disadvantages couples who are signed on together, and I apologize for that. Maybe I will figure out a way to split you up more, especially, but I don't think so. 15 minutes, 5 minutes per screen, and just, or you can speak more informally about what's coming up and hold the discomfort together. Let's bring our attention back together. And as we move towards our closing tonight, I want to ask you to share, and you obviously don't all have to share, and in the spirit of step up, step back, I encourage folks who haven't shared already, if you would like to share now, sort of what new learning you're taking away from this, and what question or questions you would like us to give more attention to in next week's session. Okay, Carol, go ahead.
I would like to pay more attention to the exercise that we just did, because I got all confused between whether something that I did was a hoof or a pleasure. I couldn't figure out if I'd walked through the garden or stopped in the garden to rub my back.
Okay, so a little bit more of examining our own motives, perhaps.
Mhm. Uh,
Go ahead, Sabina.
Thank you. This was really helpful and interesting. I would like to, and I hope we will spend more time on bringing us to the Teshuva making amends piece, because that's really kind of my goal, personal goal.
Sabina, you mean making amends with respect to racism?
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, seeing nods and thumbs up to that one. Richard?
Thank you. How does guilt fit in with all of this? I guess would be something to explore.
Yes. Great question. And let's even talk about that a little bit now.
Yeah, I would say guilt and remorse and shame, they kind of go with me feeling hopeless, like, I feel so bad. I'm not going to do anything, am I? No.
So, if I may, I want to recommend it's like a 10-minute YouTube video. It's funny. He's an East Coast based like DJ and comedian, Jay Smooth. I'm putting it in the chat. Having it's not funny guilt. Having a conversation, giving a brief TED talk on conversations about race and sort of tips for white people to how white people could react or train ourselves to better react when our own racist behaviors are pointed out to us. But I'm going to go ahead and give away like 2 of his best metaphors because I think they are such great metaphors that like we need to have them as soon as possible. He says, a lot of us think of racism as like having our appendix or not. And if racism is, if we think that we've had it removed, then it is deeply existentially terrifying when it is pointed out that we have some. And, you know, our reaction is like, I can't have racism. I had it removed in 2005. What does it mean if I have racism? Something's really, really wrong. And racism is not like having our appendix or not. That's not what it is. We have been conditioned to racism. It's around. It's very easy to do something racist. And so he suggests that we might do better to think about it like having food caught in our teeth. It's not a crisis when we have food caught in our teeth. And it doesn't mean we're a terrible person, and neither do we need to get defensive or think that it reflects on our general cleanliness. If someone says, oh, you have a little bit of green something in your teeth, you might feel embarrassed, but you're not gonna respond by saying, oh no, I'm such a disgusting person. Neither are you going to respond by saying, I can't have something caught in my teeth. I'm a clean, hygienic person. I don't get food caught in my teeth. You're going to respond saying like, oh, thank you, yuck, oops. And you're going to try to remove the food caught in your teeth. So to the extent that we can think of the racism we exhibit as, again, it kind of comes back to the ox. as this thing that happens and that we address as it happens, I think is what can really keep us well on the path towards anti-racism. You should definitely watch Jay Smooth's video, though. He says it in much funnier ways than I do. And I think, you know, remorse can be useful to the extent that it is motivating, and guilt to the extent that it gets us stuck in a story that is an unproductive story to tell, then it is, then we need to interrogate it and poke at it because it is keeping us from being our best selves. And the thing about Teshuva, we come back to Teshuva, and then I'm going to close for tonight. Teshuva is predicated on the notion of human possibility. That if we were inherently good, we wouldn't need to do Teshuva because we wouldn't mess up. If we were inherently evil or inherently corrupt, there would be no point in doing Teshuva because it would be hopeless. The whole notion of Teshuva points us towards our possibility and our great human potential to do harm when we are stuck in patterns of doing harm, but also to train ourselves towards patterns to do good. So I honor and want us to take the step towards defining how we do Teshuva for racial injustice in next week's class. We are not going to figure it all out in next week's class. I'm going to just let you know in advance that you are not going to leave class next week with the perfect blueprint for how you're going to solve the racial injustice of how you walk in the world. It's going to be a collective process because I don't do enough to address racial injustice in the world. So I certainly can't, I don't have wisdom that I can just impart to all of you. So your homework assignment, I'll figure out some readings to send you between now and then. But in addition to those, your homework assignment, to the extent that you're willing to take homework assignments, is to actually take stock of what you are doing already to address racial injustice. So that's one writing prompt. What are you doing already to address this? What is the thing that you have been sort of telling yourself you should be doing or you want to be doing, but you haven't done yet? And what is getting in the way of doing that? And what is the thing that is maybe pie in the sky or feels too impossible or too impractical for your life right now? So again, 3 questions for you to journal on. What are the things you are already doing to address racial injustice? What are the things you kind of know and think about and tell yourself that you really should be doing to address racial injustice, but you haven't done? And essentially, why not? What has been the barrier? And what are the things that you're aware of as just seeming completely beyond your capacity or practicality to do? That you would get super defensive if somebody told you should do. Okay, friends. And I also want you to think about if we were to do a me and white supremacy group long-term at TBI over the summer, is that something you would want to commit to being part of? It would be an ongoing, probably 12-week conversation and exploration group. But don't tell me now, I will poll you next week. Okay, so folks, you can click on the ellipsis in the chat to save chat if you want to, because there's really great resources that people are writing in the chat. I'm going to officially say goodnight and stop our recording, and then people can keep chatting with me if you want. So thank you for your participation this evening. Thank you for your vulnerability. So glad to have you here. It's really a pleasure doing this exploration with you.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you.